Welcome to the Wills and Estate Transmission Podcast, brought to you by De Groots, specialist lawyers in wills and estates.
Hi, and welcome to the podcast channel for degroots.com.au. And today we've got Kate Donnan having a chat about a will and the consequences of not having a will. How are you, Kate?
I'm good, thanks, Tony. How are you?
Fantastic, thank you. We've had a few recent cases of cases before the court even, whereby people thought they had a will, and then there's people who think they have a will and life has changed so much it hasn't kept up.
That's right, Tony. We're seeing it not only in the courts, as you said, but also in just the news and recent stories about people passing away unexpectedly, such as Dr. Michael Mosley, I think you've mentioned. And whilst it's good to have your will done, it's not always a set and forget, Tony, and I think that's important for people to realise.
Yeah, look, we'll go through those life phases whereby, we're single, don't really need a will.
I think we don't need a will, Tony.
Thank you for that. We think that we don't need a will. You're completely correct. And then we go through the phase of potentially buying property, where you definitely need a will, and then family and so forth. And then even when you have family, you fall in and out of different relationships with different people. You need to make sure your will keeps up with all these life changes and life phases.
That's right, Tony. And with things like blended families becoming more and more common, you may not have just one set of children, you might have two. And that's two sets of children with two different second parents. So all those sorts of things need to be covered off, particularly where you do have children. Who you pick today to look after your minor children might not be who you want to look after them in 5 or 10 years' time.
But surely if you love the children all equally, that's got to be easy.
Well, it's not so much about how much you love them, Tony. It's also about what's appropriate for your children. And we're not just talking about how much they're getting under your will. It's who's going to be looking after them while they're minors. And how do you want them to be raised if you're not there to say what your wishes are? Do you want them to get a job after school? Do you want them to see certain family members or not see certain family members, which can be the case at times? And as your children grow and change, who is the most appropriate person to look after them is also going to change.
Yeah, look, we know that kids attend school, they have the besties and the best friends, they become your friends, they become besties, and then they either change school or leave primary school, go to high school, have different friends, and your will hasn't kept up with those changes.
No, or you might have appointed your parents or your children's other parents, and that might have been all well and good when you did your will, but you might be 10 years down the track and mum and dad might not be physically able to look after your young children. Or in the case of you said, you've chosen a friend, but things have changed. They might have moved to South America and they may not want to take on the guardianship of your children anymore.
Yeah. So what I'm just thinking of it, and I don't know the answer to this question. So when you got children that are a bit older, do they have a right to say who they want to be looked after in the will?
So in terms of what you do under your will, Tony, as a will maker, as a testator, if you're a parent, you can appoint a guardian for your minor children. Now, if they have their other parent has survived you, then chances are the other parent will just take over the care of your minor children. In some cases, though, that's not appropriate. But what you're doing in your will is you're appointing a testamentary guardian, per se, for your children. But ultimately, I think it's important that people understand that it's the family court that has the ultimate say about where your children will be placed. So if you've appointed guardians under your will and there's no issues, no disputes, and it's followed through, that's fine. The family court may choose to make that order in accordance with your wishes. But if there is a dispute, then it really becomes a family law matter. And our understanding is that the older the child is, the more they're able to have a say on who they're going to live with.
Yeah, and look, The case we were talking about before was Andrew Finlay specifically, and he'd gone around telling friends he was going to update his will. Yes, I'm going to do my will. And, the thing about where there's a will, there's a way. But where there's a will, you've got to get the damn thing done. And 50% of Australian adults don't seem to have a will.
Yeah, that's right, Tony. And if you add to the 50% that do, as we've been talking about, they may not be current wills. So you've mentioned Andrew Findlay, who passed away unexpectedly in a freak accident in Sydney. And I believe that the will and estate dispute is currently before the courts, or will be shortly. But you have mentioned he kept telling people he changed his will. And that's not uncommon, Tony. We hear that a lot. Well, Mum told me she changed her will. But the reality is, particularly in New South Wales, until you go and sign that new will, it's a mere thought. Particularly someone like Andrew, who we understand from the news articles, had previously done wills with lawyers. So he knew to make this new will binding, he had to go and sign it. And it doesn't seem as though he had. So chances are his earlier will might have been his last valid will.
Yeah, and there's plenty of cases that keep popping up. There's one recently where a doctor was taking care of a person, and the doctor inherited the entire estate, and the family and everybody else are going, huh? How did that happen?
Yes, there was maybe the one you're talking about, but there were also potentially some gifts to the Salvation Army. And there was a question about whether or not it was the last valid will of the testator. So those sort of things do arise, particularly as you get older, and who is in your family and who might be left in your family changes. It's important that you're seeing an estate planning lawyer who can make sure, if you're doing something that from the outside someone might think is irrational, that if you've got a good estate planning lawyer, they've done as much as they can to bolster your wishes. So if there is any question about whether it was your last valid will, a good estate planning lawyer should be able to have their file and provide that to the court to show, look, they did know what they were doing. Nobody was coercing them. This is clearly their coherent instructions. But ultimately, the court will decide. However, the evidence that the solicitor who prepared the will has can be extremely valuable in these circumstances.
Yeah, I guess so. So if surely the will that I do with an AI or a computer or from a newsagent, surely that's going to be more valid or equally valid if it's more recent than one I prepared with a proper estate lawyer.
It might be, Tony, but chances are it won't be. So we here at De Groots, what we do is wills and estates. We do estate planning, estate administration, estate litigation. We see so many different types of matters, and that knowledge and experience feeds into our estate planning to make sure that what could go wrong doesn't. So we ask you the right questions and come up with this legally binding framework to get your desired outcomes.
Yeah. I'm just looking at another case here where someone had changed a will and, it wasn't quite legit. And the estate still has to pay for that, doesn't it?
It depends. If it's been something that the testator or the will maker has caused the issue, typically then their estate will pay to fix it. But that's not always the case. Costs are always at the discretion of the court. And depending on what's happened, they decide who pays for what. But I think as well, Tony, it's important to understand that your estate planning lawyer also understands the consequences of certain life events. So, for example, a big one, talking about Andrew Findlay is, I'm not sure if he was divorced, but he definitely had a financial settlement by the sounds of it with his spouse. So people need to understand that when you get divorced, your will typically is read as though your spouse predeceased you. So any gifts to them typically fail. The difference is if they're, say, going to be the trustee for children you share together for their inheritance. But that only happens on divorce, Tony. So it doesn't happen when you separate. A lot of people tend to be separated for even years before they're actually divorced. So you may not realize that distinction, and you'll tell, some AI or online program, no, I don't have a spouse, but you might legally still have a spouse.
Yeah, there's a lot more than what people realize. And again, I've never met a computer that could have that sense of judgment as well as a human being.
Yes, exactly. And doesn't have the experience. Whilst it may seem to draw from a vast variety of sources, it doesn't know how to discern that into how that's relevant to the person asking the questions.
Yeah, well, everybody's different.
Correct.
Okay, anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think it's just important, really, Tony, that people have a look at their wills at least every 2 years. Doesn't mean that they're going to have to do a whole new will and go through the process, which, by the way, is relatively straightforward. But just keeping in mind the sorts of things that might just happen in general life. You might fall in love with someone. You might break up with somebody. You might take out a major loan. You might have a business. You might have some other types of litigation, and all those sorts of things may not seem like they impact your will, but your estate planning lawyer will be able to tell you how it impacts your will and if you need to do anything about it.
Great. Thanks very much, Kate.
Not a problem.
Thanks for listening today. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you require any further information, please go to our website www.degroots.com.au and book a consultation. The contents of this podcast do not constitute legal advice and are of a general nature only. Listeners should make their own inquiries about their specific circumstances and seek legal advice.